The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and overambition. Darren Fields stood at the front, pointer in hand, swagger oozing from every corporate cliché he fired off. "Let's talk about impact," he said, gesturing toward the presentation slide showing inflated metrics that didn't tell the whole story. Julian Reeves sat 2 seats from the end, back straight, hands folded, expression unreadable. Darren's praise came easy, if you were loud. Greg got a standing nod for taking initiative after forwarding an email Julian wrote. Marissa was a rock star for leading a client call Julian had prepped every detail for. The deck she used? His. The metrics? His. But no mention, not even a glance in his direction. He shouldn't have been surprised. 2 years of this. 2 years of building streamlined systems, automating clunky processes, cutting their operational backlog by nearly 40%. Quiet wins, the kind no one noticed unless they disappeared. And today, one did. The dashboard Julian had flagged 3 weeks ago, the one with Theo predictive error margin creeping past threshold, had finally buckled. A missed alert led to a delivery delay for their largest logistics client. The cost 6 figures and a warning from legal. Darren didn't miss a beat. "We've identified the root of the issue," he said, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Julian. "Unfortunately, it wasn't escalated properly. This is a lesson in ownership." Julian's jaw clenched, but his face stayed neutral. He had flagged the risk in their reporting system, twice, documented it, time-stamped it. It was buried beneath status updates no one read, and Slack threads everyone muted. But Darren needed a name to blame, and Julian's was quiet enough to carry it. Meeting adjourned. People shuffled out. Greg with a smug glance. Marissa already texting. Julian gathered his notes slowly, methodically, the way he always did. Darren paused beside him. "You're sharp, Julian. You just need to be more visible." Julian met his gaze for a half second. Or maybe visibility doesn't always equal value. Darren blinked, then smiled like he hadn't heard. "We'll get it right next quarter," he said, already turning away. Julian didn't respond. He just closed his laptop, slid it into his worn leather bag, and walked back to his desk, the hum of the office swallowing him whole. But beneath the quiet, something had shifted. Because while Darren chased applause, Julian was busy building something he didn't need permission for. And someday soon, the silence they mistook for weakness would be the sound of them losing everything. Julian's success was never loud. It didn't wear a branded hoodie or dominate meetings with buzzwords. It lived quietly inside dashboards that didn't crash, project plans that never missed deadlines, and savings that showed up on quarterly reports like magic no one bothered to trace back to him. 2 years ago, he walked into Sterling Holt with no corporate polish and no interest in politics. Just a systems mind honed by necessity. Years spent freelancing while caring for his father, solving real problems without titles or teams. He listened more than he spoke, took notes in shorthand, and fixed what was broken without waiting to be asked. Within 3 months, he'd cut their onboarding process by a third. By month 6, their internal workflow backlog had disappeared. No one asked how. They just celebrated the results like weather. Good luck, nothing more. He never argued for credit. He just documented everything, every fix, every metric, every adjustment, stored quietly in versioned folders, annotated, dated, precise. He knew how companies worked, how they forgot who made the wheel as soon as it started turning. While others chased visibility, Julian chased function. And in the quiet hours, after dinners alone, after silence settled in his apartment, he coded. The idea had come out of frustration, watching bloated project trackers try to measure performance with meaningless KPIs. So he built his own, a predictive, adaptive team performance platform. It wasn't sleek at first, but it worked. It learned. By month 4, it was forecasting staffing bottlenecks with 90% accuracy. He ran it in parallel behind the company's failing tools, feeding it anonymized data, refining it nightly. On weekends, he rebuilt the backend, made it lighter, scalable. Not one line of code touched company time or property. He was careful. A year in, it had its own UI. Clean, intuitive, real. quietly alive on a server he paid for himself. By the time he applied for a provisional patent, the system had already predicted and optimized 3 internal projects Sterling Holt thought ran on Darren's vision. No one asked what Julian was working on when he stayed late. They just walked past him, assuming he was catching up. He was, but not for them. He was building something of his own, something no one could dismiss or take credit for. And when the time came, he'd walk away from all of it. Not with resentment, but with receipts. The news came by email. No subject line, just, "Congrats to Greg for stepping up as lead on the Horizon project. Well deserved." Greg, who showed up late to half the meetings. Greg, who asked Julian to explain predictive modeling to him twice. Julian stared at the screen, unmoving. The Horizon project had been his idea, his research, his system blueprint. 6 months of late nights spent designing a scalable rollout model. He'd presented it in January, refined it through spring, and handed off the implementation plan in June. Darren had nodded through all of it like he was listening. Apparently, he'd only been borrowing. Julian stood up, walked past the open-plan chaos of Sterling Holt's fourth floor, past the glass-walled conference room where Greg now sat with his feet up, laughing too loudly. He knocked once on Darren's office door. Darren looked up, mildly surprised, as if Julian were a stranger. "I wanted to talk about Horizon," Julian said, voice steady. Darren gestured to the chair across from him. "I figured you might." Julian sat. "I built that framework. I wrote every line of that scalability model. You said I'd be looped in." Darren leaned back, fingers laced behind his head, like this was a casual misunderstanding. "Julian, you're reliable. No one's questioning your work ethic. But leadership, real leadership, it's about energy, inspiration. Greg has that." He didn't flinch. "So it wasn't the work, it was the optics." "Don't take it personally," Darren said. "You're dependable, but you don't inspire confidence. People don't rally around quiet." Julian nodded once. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. Then he stood. "Thanks for the clarity." That night, Julian didn't eat. He sat at his kitchen table, a half-drunk cup of coffee cooling beside his laptop. The codebase for his platform was open. He scrolled through it slowly, line by line, until the cursor blinked over the last command. Then he opened a second window. The patent submission form was already half complete. He uploaded the final documentation, signed digitally and submitted. A low chime confirmed receipt. Then he opened a blank document and started typing his resignation. Not a dramatic declaration, just a clear measured notice. 2 weeks, no bridge burning, no second chances. By the time the city went quiet outside his window, it was done. The patent filed, the letter signed, his exit in motion. Julian leaned back in his chair and exhaled. He'd spent 2 years waiting for someone to see him. Now he'd make sure they couldn't ignore what he took with him. Julian slid the envelope across Darren's desk with a quiet precision that made the older man glance up from his screen, annoyed by the interruption. "What's this?" Darren asked, not bothering to reach for it yet. "My resignation," Julian said evenly. "Effective 2 weeks from today." Darren blinked, then gave a tight, amused smile, like someone tolerating a joke that didn't land. "You're serious?" Julian said nothing. Just sat, hands folded in his lap, the same way he had during 100 meetings no one remembered he was part of. Darren finally picked up the envelope, tore it open without care, skimmed the first line. His eyebrows lifted just slightly, then dropped again. "Look, Julian, I get it. You're upset about Horizon, but you're overreacting. Analysts don't quit over a missed promotion." Julian didn't respond. Darren kept reading, his expression faltering as he reached the second page. A summary of Julian's uncredited system improvements, cost savings, and the platform he'd developed entirely off hours. It was laid out clearly, not defensive, just undeniable. Dates, metrics, outcomes, every line a quiet rebuke. Darren scoffed. "This, is what? A victory lap?" "It's a record," Julian said. "In case anyone asks who kept the lights on." The silence thickened. Darren's jaw tensed. "You really think this company can't replace you?" Julian stood, smoothing the crease in his shirt. "I'm sure it'll try." What Darren didn't know, What he wouldn't think to ask was that Julian had already severed access to every personal file. The core engine of his platform was never hosted on their servers. The versions he'd quietly installed in Sterling Holt's systems were non-transferable and already scheduled to phase out by the end of the month. Not sabotage, just separation. He walked out of the office without a handshake. The floor was humming when he passed through, screens glowing, phones ringing, Greg laughing too loud near the espresso machine. No one looked up. And that was fine. Julian didn't need the fanfare. He'd already taken the only thing that mattered with him, the work, the kind no one saw until it wasn't there. The office at Lyric Data didn't buzz. It breathed. No performative urgency, no shouted updates over partitions. Just the hum of focused work, clean code, and people who knew why they were there. Julian walked through the space on his first morning with a calm he hadn't felt in years. No onboarding videos, no welcome swag, just a short handshake from the CTO and a login to the infrastructure he was about to elevate. They'd already reviewed his platform, not just glanced, studied, ran it through stress tests, pushed the architecture to its limits, and then they'd done something Sterling Holt never had. They asked him to teach them how it worked. By the end of week 1, the integration team had pulled his adaptive performance system into 3 client proposals. By week 2, one of those clients signed a 6-figure contract on the strength of what his platform could predict. Backlogs, bottlenecks, workforce burnout rates, all surfaced in real time, elegantly. Julian didn't lead meetings with charisma. He didn't fill whiteboards with arrows or tell people to think outside the box. He just spoke clearly, showed results, and asked good questions. And people listened, not because he demanded it, but because the room got smarter when he spoke. The system he'd built, once an after-hours side project, once dismissed as too technical for leadership, was now being used to redefine how Lyric mapped client strategy. Their delivery timelines shrank by 38% within a month. Accuracy reports spiked. Clients called to ask how they'd made such a fast leap forward. The answer was always the same. It's Julian's framework. His name for the first time wasn't whispered in side threads or buried beneath someone else's signature. It was spoken with respect. He didn't think of Sterling Holt much, but in quiet moments, usually in the half-light before sunrise, coffee in hand, dashboard humming with clean, accurate data, he'd remember what it felt like to be invisible, not bitterly, just with clarity, like remembering pain that taught you where not to go back. Here at Lyric, his presence mattered, not because he was loud, but because what he built worked. That was enough, more than enough. The first sign was small, a missed client delivery that should have auto-flagged 3 days earlier. Then a workflow bottleneck no one noticed until the queue was already bloated beyond salvage. By the time Sterling Holt's leadership caught on, 3 major accounts were weeks behind schedule, and Darren Fields was in full damage control mode. No one said Julian's name, not at first, but his absence was loud, like missing scaffolding in a building that still looked stable until the walls began to shift. Did Julian leave the source logic for the ops dashboard? A junior analyst asked, eyes scanning shared folders filled with dead links and half-labeled scripts. Silence followed. Then a murmured, "Check the archive drive." But the drive was clean. Julian's files, meticulously organized while he was there, had been transferred to local machines, overwritten or simply deleted. In his office, Darren paced behind his desk. The new system Greg had promised to elevate was already crashing under the weight of incomplete logic and missing dependencies. The analytics were broken, forecasting reports were unreliable, and client services was fielding daily complaints from accounts that had once practically run themselves. Darren called a quick team huddle. "Let's keep the narrative focused on temporary delays," he said, jaw tight, voice clipped. "We're transitioning to a new model." But the team knew. They'd leaned too long on tools they didn't understand, ones they never had to maintain, because Julian had done it for them, quietly without complaint. No fanfare, no gatekeeping, just results. Only now the foundation was gone, and no one had thought to ask how it was built. Greg tried to reconstruct one of the core dashboards by reverse engineering old versions. It didn't work. He didn't understand the logic threads Julian had woven through every layer. Predictive alerts, fail-safe flags, resource sync triggers. Not code you just copied. Code you had to understand. Darren sent out a memo calling for solutions-focused collaboration and cross-team transparency. Behind closed doors, he called in IT, demanded to know if they could recover anything. They couldn't. The system wasn't theirs to begin with. Julian had been careful. Everything legally separate, hosted off-network, nothing proprietary to the firm. The silence in meetings grew longer. So did the shadows under Darren's eyes. No one dared say it aloud, but they all felt it. The unraveling wasn't temporary, it was structural. And the man who'd held it all together? He wasn't coming back. Darren was in the middle of drafting yet another internal memo, this one titled Stabilization a Strategy, Q3 Recovery Plan, when his phone rang. Unknown number. He nearly let it go to voicemail. Then he saw the area code, Bay Area, one of their oldest clients. He answered, Darren Fields. Darren, it's Thomas Kwan, Terra Nova. His grip on the phone tightened. Thomas, good to hear from you. I was just about to reach out. I'll save you the trouble. Thomas's tone was clipped, professional but not warm. We're ending our contract at the end of the month. I wanted to tell you directly before the paperwork comes through. Darren sat up. That's sudden. Look, I know we've had a few bumps lately, but we're implementing changes. We've already started. It's not about bumps, Thomas interrupted. It's about performance. The infrastructure's collapsed. Your systems are reactive. Your timeline's unreliable. We lost a week of prep on the Trent rollout because your dashboard fed us bad forecasts. We're correcting the... We don't have time to wait for corrections, Thomas said flatly. Lyric already has what we need. We're onboarding with them now. Silence. Darren's mouth went dry. You're switching to Lyric? They've got a platform, clean, efficient, predictive, built by someone who actually understood what we needed. I assume you remember Julian Reeve. The name hit like cold water. Darren stared at the blinking cursor in his half-written memo. He's heading their systems now, Thomas continued. We didn't even realize he was the architect behind what had been working so well at Sterling. But it makes sense now. Your collapse started the moment he left. Julian never presented anything like that to us, Darren said, instinctively defensive. Maybe you weren't listening, Thomas replied. Anyway, we're moving forward. No hard feelings, but don't expect a reversal. The line went dead. Darren set the phone down slowly. The quiet in his office pressed in. Outside, through the glass walls, the floor moved at its usual buzz. But he saw it differently now. The cracks were everywhere. And they weren't just technical. They were human. Invisible scaffolding that had held the whole operation upright was gone. Julian hadn't just done his job. He'd built a framework beneath all of it, and Darren had let him walk away without even asking why. Now the industry was noticing, and they weren't just choosing Lyric. They were choosing Julian. Julian didn't even know the article had gone live until his inbox started flooding. Not with congratulations at first, but with quiet, reverent emails. Former colleagues, vendors, a client or two who'd once been indifferent, all with the same undertone. I had no idea. He clicked the link at his desk in Lyric's headquarters, the title bold at the top of the screen. The analyst who left without a sound and took the future with him. The piece in Techline Weekly didn't glamorize, it didn't dramatize, it told the truth. About how one systems analyst, quiet, methodical, overlooked, had quietly revolutionized internal performance infrastructure at a Fortune 500 firm without ever holding a VP title. About how that same infrastructure began to fall apart within weeks of his exit, and about the proprietary platform he'd built, now anchoring Lyric's meteoric rise across 3 sectors. They quoted a CTO from a mid-sized logistics client. I didn't realize until after he left that Julian had been the reason we were meeting every deadline. We just assumed Sterling Holt had finally gotten their act together. Turns out it was just him. Julian scrolled past his own face, shot from behind, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of Lyric's Chicago office, before minimizing the browser. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't care. Across town, the fallout began. The board at Sterling Holt convened that afternoon, the article printed and highlighted in fluorescent yellow. They demanded an internal audit, wanted to know how their core systems were this fragile, why no one had flagged their dependency on a single analyst's undocumented work. But it had been documented, just never acknowledged. Julian's internal submissions, proposals, reports, three of them dating back over a year, had been found buried in Darren's rejected items folder. Each with his name, each outlining a version of the same platform now driving Lyric's growth. The audit report was brutal. It confirmed what the article had suggested. More than 60% of Sterling Holt's internal process efficiency gains over the last 2 fiscal years had been the result of Julian's efforts. Work absorbed into team wins, assigned to louder voices, or simply passed over. Darren sat in the boardroom while the numbers were read aloud, face blank, fingers twitching on the pen in his lap. They asked questions he couldn't answer, asked why there had never been follow-up on Julian's proposals, why no one had secured knowledge transfer before his departure. No one said it directly, but it hung in the air. You let the future walk out the door, and you didn't even notice. At Lyric, Julian stayed late that night. Not for recognition, but because things were just beginning. And this time, the future had his name on it. The keynote ended to quiet applause, not thunderous, but real. The kind that came from people who actually listened. Julian stepped off the stage, clipboard still in hand, nodding at a few engineers who stopped to thank him. He kept his pace measured, calm. Lyric's booth was just ahead when he saw him. Darren, standing by the far wall, arms crossed, like a man still trying to posture in a room that had moved on without him. Julian didn't stop walking until Darren stepped directly into his path. Julian! He looked older, not by years, but by weight. There was a crack in the armor now. No arrogance, no smug tilt to his shoulders. Just a man trying to reach for something already out of his grasp. Didn't expect to see you here, Julian said evenly. I came for the conference, stayed for the keynote. Darren hesitated, glanced around like he wasn't sure how to stand in the presence of someone he used to overlook. You were impressive. Julian said nothing. Darren cleared his throat. Listen, I won't waste your time. The board knows what you built. They know now that we let something real slip away. He paused. They want to talk about you coming back, not as an analyst, as director of system strategy. A full team, full autonomy. We're prepared to match your current comp. Julian shook his head once, not dismissively, just with finality. You don't get it, he said. You didn't just ignore my work. You made it clear I didn't belong. So I stopped trying to fit into a place that couldn't see me. Darren exhaled, something between a sigh and a stumble. Julian, we were under pressure. Timelines, optics. I wasn't, Julian cut in, voice calm but sharp. I was under pressure too, but I never used it as an excuse to silence the people keeping things afloat. A pause hung between them. Darren's hands dropped to his sides. I'm not angry, Julian added. Not anymore. Honestly, I'm grateful. You gave me the space to build something you couldn't control, something I now own, and no title could replace that. Darren nodded slowly, but it didn't look like agreement. It looked like acceptance. Julian stepped past him. No bitterness, no drama, just forward. As he returned to Lyric's booth, one of his team members handed him a tablet, a new client request, Fortune 50, direct ask for Julian to lead the architecture call. He glanced once over his shoulder. Darren was still there, watching, but Julian was already gone, where he belonged.